This is the inner circle. We're going to discuss, in this group we're going to be discussing the question of activation and passivation.
Because there are so many who speak at the same time, it will be really hard to manage. Also, we are in the different corners. So the way visual discussion works is everyone who has to say something on the topic has to sit in the middle. And we have always one chair empty. So now there will be like 4 people talking and exchanging opinions, and one chair always empty. If you're on the outside have something to add, then you should sit there, and when someone enters the circle, one has to leave. That's the visual discussion. And then we keep the conversation in the middle for like 4 or 5 minutes each. And then the whole group decides if they should continue talking or switch to the next group of people. Okay? The way we do it is just raise the hand.
It's like a game.
We raise the hand, then they see that the majority wants to switch the topic, then we switch the topic. Okay? And you're standing here, I suppose. Yeah, there are some chairs there.
That's fascinating.
I'll explain that once again. Everyone. I was asked to wait like for 4 minutes more, so everyone who's in the living room. Yes. And then there is
No.
another question is if we can open the window because we'll get like hot in here. Hot discussion. Thank you. Just watch the head. Short steps to language. Just raise the hand so I can see the room. Oh, everyone is considering. All right, 1 person and second one, third, 4, 5. Yeah. Okay, 5 people.
These people believe you should activate.
Half. And how about passive learning? Wow. 7. All right. And then the rest.
My hand was up as well at that point, by the way. It's actually more popular discussion whether to learn actively or passively than maybe they thought, because initially they had a smaller group. But it's actually critical to the whole process of being a polyglot. So really, it's not surprising that a larger number of people have wanted to join this discussion. The alternatives, there were 2 alternative discussions. One was about Cantonese, and the other, language politics. Which I suppose.
Why don't we just start? We just start? Okay. Okay. Just, okay.
Can I suggest something? I think it's not clear. Especially for me, it's not clear what you mean with passive phase and active phase. I think you should describe a little bit, just each.
I think we should define it here.
Define it here, yeah, and so, then we know what you're gonna.
We're in the same level.
Yeah, we're in the same.
All
we're
right,
talking
so,
about the same thing.
Who has a definition of active or passive? Like the ones that they know what active or passive is. Can you please come to the circle? I saw some people that define, and we need 1 chair empty. Okay, second one.
Oh, I don't mind if I go and just I'll give my definition anyway.
Alrighty. One more. Who has an active position on one of the topics. Okay. So the way fishbowl discussion works. This is more chairs. Yeah, like part more chairs. The way the fishbowl discussion works is, again, those who are late. So only those in the middle, they can talk, because there are too many, we cannot manage discussion when there are too many. Those who are in the middle can talk on the topic. Now we want to define what active or passive is. And then,
so if somebody moves to the center,
yes,
then one of us should be honorable enough to move away.
Yes, it can be like if someone sees that one in the middle has nothing to say, or just waiting there, or if you think you have nothing to say more, you can just leave, so other person can join. But if someone joins, then one of them has to leave. You can do it like passively, just sit there and wait until someone leaves, or you can just stand in the back, like pushing someone. It's up to you. It's up to your politeness.
But I saw some places with tap on the shoulder.
You can
Tap
tap
on the shoulder somebody and they leave.
I think we'll manage somehow. Okay, so I think we should start with the active position. Who has an active position here?
On active.
On active? You're
No. Like so, an active position on active.
on active.
Okay, no, I don't have an.
Everyone is a passive.
Are we going to define
Yeah,
Alright.
define.
define what active and passive are first?
So I think what I understand about a passive phase is what a lot of people have been talking about maybe in the past 5 or 6 years, whereby somebody would ingest a large quantity without forcing themselves to produce any of the language over an undefined period of time. So it can be 3 or 6 months where they, in the background while working, listen to or watch, or perhaps actively watch something but not try too hard to understand and expose themselves to the framework of the language. I don't know much about people who are trying to read without understanding, although other than Mike Campbell, but I think it's mostly about audio-visual components. That's what I understand from a passive phase.
Okay.
That's the popular notion.
I'd like to put it into maybe a practical term. Basically, if we divide every single thing that we can do with languages into 4 basic functions: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Just about everything else that we do with languages is made up of those 4 things. Yeah, if you pray, well, that's a kind of speaking, I suppose. Reading specific things or going shopping is a combination of reading and speaking. Sometimes listening. Everything that we do in application of languages, that's made up of speaking, of listening, of writing, and of reading. So if we say that of those, reading is definitely passive, because you're receiving already ready language in, which is presumably, if it's a native done it, is correct. You don't have to produce the language, but you do want to understand it. I would differ from what you said about, you're not concerned with understanding. I would say that a passive learner still is very concerned with understanding, but he doesn't have to actually produce the language. Whereas when he's speaking, he has to produce. When he's writing, he has to produce. But when he's speaking, he has to produce at a speed that people are willing to listen. Like now, I don't want to speak too slowly and bore everybody, but if I was writing this down, I'd have all morning to write it. So the most active is speaking, the least active is reading, and if somebody's willing to just simply read, that makes them a passive learner. If they must be always speaking, that makes them an active learner. That's how I would define it.
I would add one activity: thinking while you are listening, because you can listen to people and keep the same conversation in your head without being smacked in the face with you've made errors or things like that. And in that way you can learn a language without saying a word in the language you are speaking.
Well, thanks, Nils. I've now got to redo my whole paradigm. That's about 5 blog posts I have to rewrite now.
So
Thanks.
I agree with what you're saying, but I've heard just people describe a line of passive learning where, for a certain period, they're only they're getting used to the phonemes, the way the language sounds, and they're not thinking too much actively. So I've heard of this trend where people even introduce the basic passive stage where they're not even trying very hard. So that's why I wanted to start at the basic there. But I agree that most language learners are actively trying to think through what this might mean.
I mean,
or the brain is doing it for them.
People that are happy, like, I mean, the Steve Kaufman, I don't think he would mind my saying. I'm saying it publicly. I'd say it to him if he was in the room. So Steve Kaufman is on record as saying, I like to read, that's how I like to do it. I also know for a fact that he does activate by doing Skype things with his Czech and everything, but his main way of learning is to do it by reading. There are other people, they must go to language lessons, they must have conversations, they don't want to just read books.
Think of Benny as the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah,
Benny
Benny's
goes
like
to the country and
yeah.
he actually tries to speak the language.
So it's really, you could almost define it as the Kaufman approach versus the Benny approach.
And that is my understanding of it. I'm more of a passive learner than an active learner in the first stages. I do a lot of listening. When I learned Welsh, for example, I spent 5 years listening to Welsh radio online every day at work, all day. I didn't understand anything at first, but after 5 years, I could understand it. I read courses as well.
What did you do as well?
I had course books, and whenever I read something in a foreign language, I always read it aloud. So I'm practicing my speaking. I have little dialogues with myself.
That should be a mixture, so...
Yeah, so I use a mixture. So I don't engage in conversation with people at first, generally. If I meet someone who speaks the language I'm learning, then I'll try and speak to them, like Benny would.
Sure.
But usually I run out of conversation very quickly. I wouldn't try as hard as Benny does to speak and to try and muddle through and mangle the grammar and everything, because I try and get it right.
So, I don't know, I think there's some controversy about whether this is useful, whether you gain something from this, and that's why people are interested in this, if it's something that could be useful for them or at all interesting. And so, my personal experience learning Catalan is that I had a very specific and protected environment where I didn't have to speak in Catalan for 6 months. I went to a friend's house and said, I'll help you rebuild it. I was there for 6 months. Her mother spoke to me every day, and I said, I'll speak English to you, and if we don't understand each other, we'll attempt to define what we're saying in our own language as well as we can. And so I had the patience of a person who also is a language specialist, works as a translator and as a corrector in Catalan, and explain something when I didn't understand it. She could understand enough English so that she could tell if I was misunderstanding. And over that period, I was never forced to speak it, but I was trying to understand it because she told me to do something like build this wall, and I had to get it, right? So I feel that that's more, like people say, children learn without trying, but actually, some people do. But children actually, it's an active process where they're being corrected thousands of times until they're 5 or 10 years old by their parents and by adults. And they don't master the language perhaps until after they go to school, but yes, they speak fluently. And so I found that my process was like this, where I was saying something, and I said, you mean this? And he said, no, it means this in Catalan. And then after 6 months I said, okay, June 1st I'm going to start speaking. And at first it was a disaster. And over the period of maybe 6 months, I sort of put it into shape. And I would say that I don't know if this had an effect on it, but I feel like my accent is more refined than it might have been if I had just tried to speak right away. Because I got so used to hearing how things were pronounced, even before I ever read a word, and I feel like this helped me.
Speaking about Catalan, take that, okay, sorry.
Sorry, she just came, so I feel like you should interject.
It would seem that it's one arrow in a quiver of many tools you can use. You were clearly not in any mad rush to learn Welsh.
No.
You know, you listened for 5 years. When I want to practice a language and I'm feeling kind of lazy, well, you know, Radio Nacional Español in the morning over breakfast, I can check it off my list. It's in Spanish today. But it depends what you want to do with the language, how urgent it is, and of course the passive skills, the reading and the listening. You'll know if you get it wrong. Only you will know if you get it wrong or right. But the speaking, you already have to produce something, and the writing, you have to produce something at a very high level. Well, depending on what you want to use the language for. But if you want to produce at a high level, you really need to use it, and then the active really comes in. Certainly, the passive is a tool. I listened for like 10 years to Hindi movies. And when I went to India, I was like, wow, you know, a little bit came out. It's great. But it was very unstructured. I didn't know if it was right or wrong. The pronunciation was probably like iffy. You know, it wasn't that I made a serious effort to learn the language. It just sort of kind of happened by listening to Hollywood.
When I said about Catalan, I have a complete experience there. I have studied Catalan as a written language, and I learned some of grammar, And then I came down and put myself on a hotel bed watching Spanish television and translated it.
It works.
And because
No, it works.
nobody was going to tell me it was wrong. I just followed to
Aha.
The big problem about speaking is you get stuck. If somebody pushes you and doesn't punish you at the same time, then you can learn to be active. Then you can be active without any direct consequences. And in that way you have made a lot of passive study and suddenly discover you can speak the language after a couple of weeks.
I agree. I think that there's this conversation happening so far that passive and active are sort of on these different spectrums that are quite separate from each other, and I think they're actually not as apart as we think they are. Because if you talk to yourself, are you actually talking or not? Like, nobody can hear you, you can hear yourself, and if you're an introvert, a lot of times you speak to yourself to practice, and then you quickly find out you don't know what teaspoon means if you're cooking something, for example, and then you get these little nuggets of information coming at you, and you're like, oh, shit, I don't know that, I gotta, here's something in my vocabulary that I have to study, trying to create a list of what you can...
I was just going to allude to that. Except for maybe Latin, why do we learn a language if not to use it in conversation, mainly?
Because sometimes it's like, for example, I happen to speak German because I live here, but being able to write something in a particular way, in a particular language, I don't like the sound of German, for example, I'll say that out loud right now. But to be able to construct things in the way you can construct them in a written form, I think is really interesting. I'm also a technical writer, so I do more things on that.
So am I.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk later.
Yeah, so...
I think a distinction that was coming up with what people have just been saying is whether or not you're using the language of other people rather than using it, or rather than an active-passive distinction. I mean, if you're actively thinking in a language and trying to create it, or even trying to carefully listen to it and follow all of the phonemes and so forth, that's in many ways a very active process, but it doesn't involve production. And so I think it's worth distinguishing between producing a language, using it with other people and giving feedback, and simply passively listening to, say, Welsh on the radio for 5 years. And you can argue about whether some of these are passive or active, but they're quite distinct methods with quite distinct results. So I think it's worth drawing the distinctions.
Absolutely, and I think that self-correction can't be underestimated. Like we tell ourselves information, we notice what we're doing incorrectly, or something that we find, here's a syllable that I just missed completely, or I forgot this S, or I didn't hear the S when I'm dictating something. And you start to break this down.
And within the gamut of what's often called passive, you have everything from listening to 5 years of the radio to very, very carefully paying attention and dissecting and analyzing everything you come across.
I think one important element is sort of confidence that you put, maybe reading makes me feel confident because I understand and I can control that. But for some people like Benny, maybe I can do that. I can control a conversation. I know 7 words in Esperanto. Yesterday I had a conversation on the train with somebody. They didn't know Esperanto, so I could control it. And I think, but that's the point, I think, and that was active. So, but at the same time, I think whatever makes you feel uncomfortable, maybe it could be reading or like trying to talk. Italians, I'm Italian by the way, and we are notoriously famous because we win football. Yesterday we won. But we're famous because we speak crappy
We were robbed.
and in school we do a lot of active. We can talk like, how are you, fine, thank you, forever. My mom will know every grammar rule, but then we go to England and she doesn't understand anybody, and then she feel like, acqua, per favore, like she will
Hence
make it
the
up.
drawback of only learning passively.
And this is a well-known drawback of learning passively. The extreme case is people who are raised passively bilingual and can't produce any of their languages, or can't produce one of their languages at all. And there are a lot of people like that out there. Well, they never really had cause to produce one actively, and then they feel awkward or whatever when they try. So, it's obviously possible to to understand the language.
You're talking with everybody. So.
It's obviously possible to understand the language at effectively a native level and be horrible at producing it because it's easy to find people who can.
So this is a parallel when I was living in a small town in Catalonia. Although everybody's sort of like known, everybody, of course, all Catalans are 100% fluent in Spanish when they're adults. But it turns out that in this generation, there are some kids who live in these areas and they only watch the Catalan stations, and maybe but they watch a lot of movies, they play video games, they're in Spanish. And a lot of them, the kids I was teaching, it turns out that their Spanish teachers were having trouble because their Spanish production was not native, and they were really confused by this occurrence. Suddenly you have Catalan kids in this recent generation who are like, okay, I understand everything I hear, I get the jokes, but when I speak Spanish it's really clumsy, and that's really odd for them, because they're just Spanish people, they speak Catalan native, of course they're native, you know, but they at home, their entire sphere of family and friends is all in Catalan, and so if they never produce Spanish, they don't have that sense maybe of it. And so that's curious. That's the same, it's a parallel to level 2 like language, second language learners as well, I think. They are second language learners if they don't do that at home, I guess. Yeah.
My question to the audience, do we now get, do each of you get now what is passive and what is active? Right? So, does anyone have still?
Yes, I do. I have a question. Because I just want to make sure that passive learning is the same thing as intuitive learning. Because everybody speaking here just living in an environment where everybody speaks the language and learning the language just by listening to it. And I think part of passive learning is also like reading a book, a grammar book, even though you don't produce, you don't speak to anyone, but even though you are learning the language and producing the language. And most of the cases people are talking here about were about intuitive learning, like just living in an environment where the language spoken.
If you're implying that, that's what I'm saying. I'm not actually. I just, as I said, I happen to speak German, which is bullshit because I just sit there and read and I study and I listen and in fact, it's easier for me to learn German in San Francisco than it is here because a lot of people speak English. And when I speak to people, they speak German to me, but still I hear it and I work in English and I do have obviously German colleagues and I have to make a concerted effort to actually use and produce and expose myself to the language much more than one might think. And not only that, if you're living in a country, all of a sudden you know, but just how much you don't know, and that can be exhausting over time. Whereas you can control that exposure to what you don't know in another environment. So I would say intuitive, that would maybe work in another environment where there's a lot less English or a lot less of one's native language.
I would say that intuitive is the last word I would use because there are two activities, two kinds of activities. Now those where you study in an intensive way and you study, I study word list, some people study word list, some people make Anki and they read grammars, things like that, and that has nothing to do with intuition. I think that's clear. And then there are those activities where you work in an extensive way, and that means you use the things you already know to force yourself through text without losing the momentum. And the important thing is not losing that momentum. It is not learning a word more or 2 words more. And that's intuitive, because there you don't use a dictionary if you can avoid it. You just hurry through the text and try to get the meaning while you are hurrying through the text or listening to people or something. And that can be passive if you don't respond, you don't ask, you don't write, you don't speak to people. It is still passive. It's just another kind of activity than the one I said is not unintuitive because you study hard. Studying hard, that's unintuitive. Studying extensively by reading through things, that is probably intuitive, but it doesn't have to be. And the last thing, that's when you start to use it to other people, and then you have to be intuitive because there's no way you can keep up looking up words while you speak.
Yeah, I'm currently living in Polyglot land, which is Switzerland. For me, it was really weird, and this idea of the intuitive learning, when I got there, I was like, how do these people manage 13 cantons with, each person has its own, like, each part of the country speaks a language, and then there's, Romansh, that like 12,000 people speak, and somehow they manage with that. But what I see on the streets, and this is basically what I've been feeling out there, because I've been there for 8 months only, is that I find it very hard to believe that there is actually 100% passive learning. Because if, while while they listen to the other people, they respond in their own language. It's really weird. Like, one person is speaking Swiss German and the other answers in French, and they can communicate because they have listened to people from the other part of the country their whole lives, so they can understand what they are saying, but they don't feel confident enough to respond in the same language, so they respond in their mother language. But at the same time that they have been listening and being in contact with all these other languages, they have been thinking. And I guess there is no learning without thinking. And whether you are reading or listening, you are actively organizing that information in your brain. So, and this is my opinion, really. Listening and reading are more passive than speaking and writing, for sure. But I don't think reading and listening are 100% passive. And I do believe that the active factor is the factor that makes these people communicate.
I misunderstood you in the beginning. I thought you said there is something like 100% passive learning. You didn't say that, right?
The other way around.
Thank you. That's exactly what I would say. There's no such thing as passive learning from my point of view, because your brain is always there. If your brain is not there, you're not learning. It's a simple fact. You cannot learn while sleeping. Try it. Put a Chinese book under your pillow. But I would simply rename the thing. I would say there's something like productive and receptive learning. I think that definitely puts it to the point. And the other thing I just realized here, I'm rather a language teacher than a polyglot. I just speak 2 languages next to German. I think it makes a huge difference if you learn with a teacher, tutor, or on your own. Yeah, if you're on your own, I'd rather tend to be more careful and take more time. But with a teacher, here I have students who come here and right away want to learn German. They don't want to wait a month and just listen to things. So they are in daily life right away, and they want to buy their whatever, bananas, tickets and everything right away. So there's no waiting. There is no chance that they will wait for you.
So this is my experience learning German, where I had to be here and conduct myself as an adult. But when I was learning Catalan and Spanish, even though I'm gone to Spain now, so my learning isn't going on, I found that I had that, it was like a privilege to have these 6 months where they're like, yeah, we know, you want to have a try and experiment, or you want to take your time, you don't have to do it. I'm still very actively learning, I'm asking them questions, but I'm trying to decipher their language. I'm really trying to learn how to comprehend everything they're saying. And never mind their full idiomatic use of the language and not treating me as if I were a language student and trying to use only standardized language. It was something else entirely. And so there's this, it's sort of like a combination between what's known as passive, or how did you describe it again?
Receptive.
Receptive. So
receptive.
Yeah, I was very receptive, and then I allowed myself the privilege of not stressing myself at having to communicate too much with people, other than some of the other workers in the house, like who weren't part of the family. Occasionally saying a few words to them, but really not trying at all. And then actively going in, basically had a linguistic mother. I had my friend, who's now my wife, her mother, I guess living 6 months in the same house as somebody. Basically she was my linguistic mother, and basically my real mother the whole time, telling me, no, this is what I mean, this is what I mean, this is wrong, this is like this, chatting all day long. And I was working on the house, but literally I would just receive lots of chatter up to 10 hours a day sometimes. So that's really like, that's a combination of these approaches, and it's sort of like, yeah, very active, and it's maybe more closely approximating how a child would learn, because they don't have a choice, they're just following this person along and hearing chatter all day long, and then at some point trying to produce language. And I think people have had this idea that they wanted to remove like the affective filter and the stress of having to produce in an environment where you have to behave as an adult, and I can appreciate that, and I see how that totally works, at least in terms of like, getting used to an accent and producing it well. But I think for me, what I saw more effective was at some point forcing myself to communicate and having somebody there correcting me all the time, which will not be possible for 99% of language learners.
Now you mentioned teachers. I think the one reason I don't want to take courses is as a teacher. And the problem is that what does it teach? I expect the teacher to correct me. While the thing I want from course is not studying the words, not studying grammar. I do that by myself. I expect the teacher to make me speak. And if I'm correct all the time, I stop speaking.
Oh, then the teacher has to be more sensitive.
Yeah, but some teachers are not sensitive.
Then you should change them.
And there's one thing more wrong in teaching. You are with a lot of students who are even worse than you are. And they are your co-teachers. And they spoil the way you teach. They shouldn't learn.
May I still ask, you're talking about group courses, right?
Group courses.
I'm talking about
one-on-one. Okay, that's a difference. One-to-one, okay.
So I'm actually living in Switzerland too. So I wanted to respond to what you said. I'm living there for like 20 years. And I actually saw that many times in a train with a group of sort of 3 people, they're talking French, German and Italian to themselves. Everybody talking the same one language and everybody understands each other. But it has nothing to do with the passive learning whatsoever, because the parts of Switzerland are completely independent concerning the informational input. I mean, if you can be completely independent language speaking, because you can have all the information in French, all the information in German, all the information in Italian. They actually learn these languages. Languages are mandatory. 2 languages are mandatory in school. Yes. That doesn't mean they can speak them forever. Because school. Yes, they learn at the school, so they can understand. They can understand. They have the basics. And then when you are listening or when you're reading, when you are obtaining passively, when you're obtaining the information, then you can organize it in your brain, and then maybe you can speak, or you can make you understand it better. So that's why usually they don't speak at all. They can understand, but usually they don't speak at all. But it's true that Switzerland is highly multi-language country. And there are a lot of language schools, a lot of language everything. And what I remarked that they actually teach people. I was learning French there. I was learning French in school, basically, and I passed the examination, university examination, in 9 months from there. And what they use is massive immersion. They speak you only in French or in German, and they force you to speak from the day one. They force you to communicate from the day one. And I don't think personally, when I'm studying myself, I can see that the passive, well, it depends what we describe as passive. If you're like, you just put in the middle and you're just receiving the information is garbage. You don't understand, but you don't understand anything. You don't understand anything, it's just noise. It's just noise all the time. So you just have to have a structure in your head where to put things, where to make sense of things. And then it's never not grammar, it's sort of basic words and basic structure to at least make sense of the things. And then when the information is put up on there, then you can expand. But I'm not sure that the pure passive immersion can work.
I think that to sort of tie in the school concept that you're talking about, where there's a lot of people who are studying in classes, and we have these things, and then actually,
Yeah.
nice to meet you. I follow you online. So he runs Smart in German, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you do mostly private instruction, at least only private. So I wanted to make up an important point from my perspective that it's really important as learners to tell your teacher, or to be the teacher, teach your teacher how to teach you. And so we need to reverse, and many of us do, say, I'm interested in this is where my motivation lies, this is what I'm doing, be very clear about the fact that you don't want to spend 10 minutes at a grocery store to buy the right detergent such that your dishwasher doesn't explode, which it actually did for me. It's like, fuck, you know. Sorry. So, you know, rather than learning from textbooks in a classroom and talking about cultural shifts and, okay, I'm coming from the United States and I have these sunglasses that are this color, and I go to Japan and my sunglasses are this color, and a combination of this culture makes them this other color. No, I need to yell at my neighbors at 2:30 in the morning. How do I do that? I need to call somebody on the phone saying, I didn't confirm that my email is actually associated with this new account and it's connected to my PayPal, which now has my bank information, and, you know, so that's really important. Someone's calling me and I'm terrified of the phone. I actually one time got up out of my chair and I'm like, wait, my cell phone's coming with me. I still have to talk to them. So I think as learners we really need to say, hey, this is what I'm interested in, and this is, even though we talked about this last week, maybe this week I'm interested in this, and this is what I've done, and here, do something with this.
Yeah, the problem with the clusters is like they are all centered on people of the very specific demographic.
Not necessarily.
Well, the class books, sometimes, the standard, they are for people of maximum 20 years old.
Material, okay.
Material is like 20 years old, they're students.
Yeah.
They come into the country first time, and when you're on your fifth language and you're learning how I'm, I don't know, Smith, and I'm coming here studying, and the university and everything, and I want to buy a watch, I mean, come on. And it's always the same dialogue, the same dialogue for every standardized material ever. Apart from Asilo, I think that the only people who carry the dialogue that has nothing, anything to do with life.
Which is why I bring newspaper articles to my classes, and I say this is what I've studied, or here's a recipe that I've done, or I just listened to this, here's my problem with this pronunciation, or I do pronunciation work with the person I'm working with, and she tells me what my intonation sounds like, where my stress issues are, why something shifts from one term in this context to another. I can't do that myself, so it's sort of been integrated.
Yeah. I think it's interesting how little we talk about how as learners we can see where our strengths are, and really use those, and not just develop our weaknesses. So in the textbooks you have a very standardized approach, and not only telling your teacher this is how I learned, but like figuring out for yourself.
Yes.
Here like we have so many people writing about so many things, we all have our own methods, and then how do I know what's going to work for me? So I think I will see the role of the teacher is kind of shifting if we want to keep up with like everything that's going on online.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't even realize where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are, because when you're on a standardized approach, you are feeling, which is false, that you are mastering that part, and then you are like with a real person and you try to do it and they don't understand.
You're going up the steps, but like, is it the right staircase?
Yeah.
But the problem is when you teach, or when the student comes and the student thinks, like, it's a different crowd of people here, then you're not all language learners. So the student comes and says, this is how I learn best, but where have you learned to learn? In school? Do they teach you how to learn in school? I don't think so, at least not in my time. I'm a bit older, maybe they changed that. So you have to observe, you have to analyze constantly the process of the student and see, okay, is he going or she going in the right direction, and then see what's wrong. So you can always shift and change. I don't have a method, I have a system. That's a huge difference. Berlitz has a method. If you do something else than the method, you cannot teach for them. If you have a system, you can expand, you can analyze, you can change. It's more flexible and can integrate the learner with a totally different approach. I started with Berlitz, by the way, and I'm thankful for that because it gave me a good start. But I would never recommend going to Berlitz again, because that method is just ridiculous. And I want to come back to that. Total immersion is something only Berlitz offers so far, maybe one other school I've seen, and yeah.
They use it in Finland.
Yeah, it costs a shitload of money.
Yes.
For just bombarding you 8 hours a day or 6 hours a day with German, in my case, or any other language you want to learn, even having lunch with you, not giving you a single break. That is from point of learning psychology, totally ridiculous. Of course, you have a few breaks here and there, but it doesn't work simply to be exposed to the language if you cannot process it. By simply being bombarded or living in Germany, you can, I think, even listening to the radio, if you don't try to make an effort to put that into what you already know, then it has no effect whatsoever. I can learn 10 years to Chinese if I don't even try to understand. Somehow, I will not learn a single word of Chinese. Maybe I will be able to reproduce a sound, but definitely not know what that
but
means.
But that's how our brain works. It puts the new information on the top what we already know.
Yes, but how am I able to put that together if I don't understand? Learning can only happen when you understand. And of course, reproducing, like learning by heart or reproducing sounds, that's possible by listening and just repeating the sounds like a parrot. Yeah, they don't understand what they say.
It doesn't take it too far.
I'd like to just bring it away a little bit from learning in country, because a lot of this where you're talking about going to, this is learning in country. A lot of us are polyglots who are interested in, well, far too many languages probably, and they can't go to far too many countries, or at least not all at once. They want, a lot of us are sort of like, obviously we have to be self-learners. The question really for many of us is, are we going to be self-learners just simply copying out words from a book, or using word lists, or reading a lot with the Steve method that we mentioned at the beginning? Or are we going to be doing the sort of level up thing that Moses does and go out and always be finding people to talk to like they wanted to listen to us in the first place? They don't necessarily manage to get a captive audience like we have in the room, or it's not entirely captive. But nevertheless, my theory is basically this, and I keep telling this online to lots of people if they want to listen to it. Activation for most of us during the process of learning is an absolute waste of time. Because,
activation.
Yes, activating, making it so that you can talk, making it so that you can't just read a language and know what it said, but you can actually produce fluent sounding language, even when you haven't really finished learning the language, but nevertheless you can talk. Some of this is driven by the fact that we want to do the performing skill. We want to be able to stand up and bring it forth speaking. That's the gold standard speaking. We want to be able to do that even when we haven't even finished really learning the language. We want to be able to show that we can actually do it, and there's no other better way than actually being able to speak it with a nice accent. However, every time we try to do that, we're deflecting time from the actual most effective process of learning, which is passive learning, definitely much faster. Yeah? We're deflecting from the ability to work on the language much faster, much more effectively, by going out and finding the people to talk to. That all takes time. Often, like you mentioned, there's a big expense in it. And, yeah.
I actually don't agree. Yes, I don't agree at all. For the point of view of learning the vocabulary, it's not necessary to speak, but at least to produce something in it. It's the point of view from memory. It's absolutely essential.
No.
You don't memorize unless you can reproduce it.
No.
You can't.
No, that's absolutely not true, sorry.
Yes, you can recognize. But when you are trying to find this word, the word won't come.
It will come. It will come, but you need to go through 3 days of activation. But you don't have to do that all the time while you're learning it.
No, you don't have to do it all the time. No.
But when you can spend, I mean, it takes 400 hours to learn the language reasonably well. When you've spent 400 hours doing that, you can spend 3 days in a country activating it, and you'll be perfectly okay. You don't actually have to keep going all the time. Anyway, I should pop off.
I just wanted to quickly comment on what Mike was saying. If you listen to dozens or hundreds of hours of pretty much any language, you'll end up picking some things up because you find that there are cognates, there's some things that are incredibly obvious to context. You start getting an idea of what words are used to introduce people and so forth. So even if you're not trying, you'll pick up a little bit that way. It's the least effective.
I disagree.
It's the least effective method I know. But in a few hundred hours, you will pick up at least a couple of.
If it's a similar decipherable language, and if you are given the context, but listening to the radio, I don't know what's happening there.
They might talk about washing machines. I'm not able to figure that out
You're not-
ever in life.
you're not
That's
gonna-
right.
Chinese or Japanese, for example, because
That's
they're
right.
so different. There is no cognates unless they
As a
have
high
put
schooler,
that
I
into.
did this a bit with Japanese without knowing any better.
How did you figure that out?
Okay, washing machines, I never did, but at a certain point, you start understanding Ohio and hi and so forth, and people are going, oh, yes, yes, like every 3 seconds. You pick up, like I said, not much, not fast, but not nothing.
You will never learn Japanese better, so they do I disagree.
It's true.
I'm not saying you'll
Ohio,
learn it,
yes, fine, but
yes,
these
I'm
are
not-
transcribed. They use the foreign words to. But what does it do? What is that? How is that language learning?
I'm disagreeing with your statement that in
Ohio
10
said
years
they
you'll
were
learn
not
nothing.
Dakota.
I agree that it's very
Well,
limited.
that was a bit extreme at times, but I give you 5 to 10 minutes, whatever. But no.
That's more than that, but
Surely, language learning is a gradual process, and every little helps. Listening and speaking and having a go, and at its best, we can be exposed to a language for a long time and gradually push ourselves a bit more. But I find it hard to imagine learning a language completely from either being completely passive, that is studying, and not trying to produce anything, or trying to produce continuously bum before you try to. Surely we need to just make efforts to do a bit of everything and not worry too much, and if we do it, when we do enough, and that it will come together, and try to get as much exposure as possible, but also try to create.
I think that speaking of getting a little bit of everything, I understood that I need basically 2 things, and they are a little bit opposed. Like, frustration is one of them. I think Benny talks a lot about frustration, like when you go to the country and then you cannot communicate. And then I think that the brain, realize, I need to memorize these words or these things. I studied English I studied maybe for 10 years at school, and I could not memorize the vocabulary because I think that it was irrelevant for my brain. And but again, starting from day one, I think sometimes it's too much because, for example, when I tried to learn Polish, people would say words to me, and I couldn't even repeat. And then when I finally could, I would forget it maybe like after 5 seconds. So I realized that I like to divide, instead of active and passive, I like to divide it as like getting used to the language and active phase. So instead of like speaking from day one, I like the speaking from day 10 approach. I give to myself 10 days to get used to the language. I read as much as I can. And then after a few days, it just started realizing how the language works, how instead of pushing yourself to speak from day one, and then a lot of speaking and getting frustrated and not being able to communicate, and I think that it really helps in terms of memorization.
Thank you. I'd just like to comment on, a lot has been said about going to the country, and while you are immersed or while you are at a place where that language is spoken, you would have more chances of picking up passively, you know what's going on around you. I'm living right now in Switzerland, but I haven't been there long enough to figure out what's going on with me. So what I know is what usually happens to my students while I taught English, and I've been a teacher for a while. What happened was that some of my students would go to the US or to Canada or to the UK or Australia, whatever, and they would come back maybe with a few more, with a little more vocabulary, with their their comprehension skills obviously were immensely better, but they weren't necessarily communicating better, because it's very hard for you to find a native correcting a foreigner on the street. So you would just ramble on, and you just talk, and the person, you know, usually people say, oh, it's so nice that they're trying, and then you just go on and on and on, and no one corrects you, so you never know if you are speaking correctly or not. Whether this be on pronunciation or grammar or the correct use of an expression or an idiom or whatever. And I believe that, and that's why I think no full learning on its full sense, on communicating fluently can come only or mostly from passive learning, or because you need to be corrected either by yourself if you're learning by yourself or by someone else, and it's really hard for that to happen when the person is only living at a place, because nobody's going to correct them, so they'll just repeat their mistakes forever, and that'll be fossilized. And then for that to change in time, it's a lot harder. I don't know.
Okay, I want to thank everyone because we're out of time now.
Oh, sorry.
I want to give a round of applause for her also.